ask the members to take their seats. We want to welcome everyone to this meeting. It seems like we were only here a couple weeks ago, and we were actually here a couple weeks ago for our last meeting. A couple things today. I think at one point one of the committees might have been experiencing some difficulty with the mics, but I think we're working now. But if not, we do have one over here that staff will get around to you to make sure that you can be heard. And we do need to have use mics to make sure it comes through on the taping of the meeting. Before I call the meeting, I have a member that wants to introduce some guest, Representative Smith. I'm sorry.
Well, I'll take the
You're much better
demotion
than
there.
Senator Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I'm proud to say that I've got Easton Stovall with me today. I've known his family for over 40 years in Knox County. His mother's in education. She's with us, Brittany. And I'd like for the committee to welcome him.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome. At this point, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll.
Senator Chambers Armstrong, Senator Carpenter, Senator Mills, Senator Schickel, Senator Southworth, Senator Turner, Senator Webb, Senator Westerfield, Senator Wheeler, Senator Williams, Representative Fallman, Representative Blanton, Representative Bowling, Representative Bridges, Representative Burke,
Here.
Representative Chester Burton,
Here.
Representative Dossett, Representative Dotson, Representative Flannery, Representative Fugate,
Here.
Representative Gentry,
Here.
Representative Grossberg, Representative Johnson,
Here.
Representative McCool,
Here.
Representative Miles, Representative Smith, Representative Wesley, Representative White, Representative Williams, Co-Chair Smith, and Co-Chair Gooch.
Here. Okay, we do have a quorum, so we're duly constituted to do business. We only have one item on the agenda today. I know that several members have to leave to make some other meetings. So we will ask for a motion to approve the minutes since we do have a quorum. Okay, motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed by like sign. Okay, the minutes do stand approved as submitted. What we're going to do today is hear a presentation from members of PJM. That's one of our service grid operators in Kentucky. And so at this time, I would like to ask them to come forward to introduce themselves and welcome. And I know you came a long ways, and we're honored to have you here today.
Chairman Gooch and members of the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. We sincerely appreciate it. We are from PJM Interconnection. We are the regional grid operator for 13 states and the District of Columbia, including about half of Kentucky. So the transmission owners that are within the PJM footprint are Eastern Kentucky Power Cooperative, Duke Kentucky, and AEP's Kentucky Power. And so we are very, again, honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I've got a brief presentation, happy to engage in a discussion about grid operations and this concept of ensuring a reliable energy transition. And we'll get there. We'll get to sort of what I mean by an energy transition here in short order. First of all, sort of the basics of power delivery and where does PJM sit within that sphere of power delivery. So I'd like to think of power delivery really having three components. The actual creation of a watt, that's generation of a watt, and then the transmission of that watt across a high voltage system, which then finds its way eventually to a distribution substation where it's then delivered to consumers. So the generation of a watt, the transmission of that watt, and then the distribution of that watt to homes, businesses. We, PJM Interconnection, and grid operators like us, there are 9 of us in North America, we are the grid operator on the generation side as well as the transmission side. And so the distribution component, generally speaking, will be regulated locally, typically by state commissions, both rates, safety, and reliability. But we exist on what's called the bulk electric system, generation and transmission of watts. Our primary focus is the concept of reliability, making sure that across the bulk electric system, that power is generated and transmitted, and that we maintain reliability. Very simple. When consumers flip the switch, the lights come on. When the manufacturer is running their manufacturing line, the lights stay on. No matter how challenging the circumstances, reliability is our core mission. We do that through 3 core business functions. We do it through operations. And operations is effectively, and we'll go to the next slide actually, because I think the visuals are better here. Operations is effectively the air traffic controller of the bulk power grid. And so we do not own any of the assets. We don't own any of the generators. We don't own any of the transmission assets. What we do is we, like an air traffic controller, effectively navigate, effectively in real time, a watt's generation and eventual delivery to that distribution substation. We do it through our planning function, again, preserving reliability through our planning function. And through our planning function, we are taking a long-term outlook at the grid and saying, hey, where do we need to create transmission in order to ensure that these watts will continue to be delivered reliably from point A to point B? We do it through markets. We've got, in our footprint, about half of our states that have restructured, meaning their generation is in the competitive wholesale sphere. So a generator, a utility does not go to the commission to ask to construct a generator, and they don't receive regulated returns. Effectively, that is all markets driven. And we have about half of our jurisdictions that still have a vertically integrated utilities are building generation, and those generation plans are effectively approved by a PSC. So we've got both in our footprint, but we do have markets because the goal is to try and drive down cost for consumers. So reliability in and of itself is, in the way we view it, a very strong mission. But why have this regional scale? Why advance regionality if we're not going to save consumers money? And so reliability and affordability, cornerstones for what we do at PJM Interconnection. And I see we've got a question here.
Sure, Representative Blanton.
I was okay to wait till the end of the presentation, if that'll be all right, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, certainly. But let me ask you this.
Please.
Okay, so the states that allow utilities to build their own generation or whatever, are those deregulated states, what we used to refer to as deregulated?
The states, so can you ask the question one more time? I'm sorry.
Okay. Are those what we call deregulated states, where they're not really, if they don't have to go to the PSC, they're not operating
To construct generation, that's correct.
monopoly system, so they're
That's
deregulated.
right. That's right.
Okay.
Deregulated, restructured, I think they're pretty synonymous.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, we're going to do a few more background slides. Then we're going to talk about what we see as, from PJM's perspective, something that we are being very vocal about, and that's trying to maintain reliability during the early stages of an energy transition. So this is PJM's existing installed capacity. It's basically the resources that exist on PJM's system to conceivably provide power to consumers. You'll see we've got a mix of natural gas, of coal, of nuclear, and we've got a growing number of renewable resources, still less than roughly 10% on the PJM system. But then if you look at this graphic, you will see that our queued capacity. So what does that mean? What is queued capacity? It's basically the generation that gets in line to try and interconnect into the PJM system. See that our queued capacity, largely consists of solar, storage, wind, and some natural gas. So a lot of renewable resources trying to find their way onto the PJM system. And it's because of what is in our queue that we believe that we are in the early stages of what we're calling an energy transition. Now, PJM has very successfully handled an energy transition in its history. And that transition really was the shale gas revolution and how many gas generators were built as a result of the shale gas revolution. So we're not unaccustomed to having a new fuel source find their way onto the PJM system. But this transition presents some, we'll call them different reliability challenges. And I want to describe those challenges to you all and then talk to you about what we plan to do about it. So knowing that we are in the early stages of this energy transition, adding a significant chunk of generation that will be part of our fuel mix to the PJM system, we have been studying this transition. We've been really taking aim at studying this transition. PJM Interconnection is a collection of engineers and economists, and we pride ourselves on producing strong analytics to help support the direction that the organization and its members should go in. So we have been studying the energy transition. This is an example of a few papers, pieces of analysis that we have put together. Happy to send you links, share these analyses with you. We're going to spend our time focusing primarily on this middle analysis, which we affectionately refer to as the 4R paper: resource retirements, replacements, and risks. And what this study effectively shows, the 4R paper, resource retirements, replacements, and risk, is that we are with the aggregation of some trends, and we're going to talk about those trends. With the aggregation of some trends, we are concerned about being in a supply crunch at the end of this decade. Now, I want just for a second for everybody in the room, because when you hear that, probably there's some concern, but just, sort of deep breath. PJM Interconnection actually is very well positioned today. Okay, so recently, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, this is an organization whose sole responsibility as ascribed to it by the federal government, their sole responsibility is to evaluate reliability of all the grids in North America. 2/3 of this country may have to, when the weather gets really hot this summer, 2/3 of this country is at risk of having to shut customers off. PJM Interconnection is not in that elevated risk zone. So we are happy to send you that report, but just so first, kind of deep breath, we are not in that highly elevated risk arena. And so we have time, but we don't have a lot of time to waste. And so what we're going to tell you is we've identified some concerns around reliability, and we're going to lead to try and help solve those concerns. We're going to focus on one of those concerns in particular that is a result of that 4R paper, and that's sort of the supply crunch that we could see towards the end of that decade. Here are the trends that comprise that 4R paper. The first is this concept of demand. What's the demand on the system? So you've got, very basic fundamentals of supply and demand. And generally speaking, you want enough supply to meet demand with a bit of a reserve margin, okay? On the demand side, we are expecting, after some years of relatively stagnant growth in demand, and load and demand are somewhat synonymous terms. After some years of pretty stagnant growth, we believe that on our system, we are going to experience some load growth. And that load growth will be attributed primarily to this concept of electrification. There is a movement towards electrification, as well as data center proliferation in our footprint. We've got quite a few data centers that have located within our footprint. In fact, a huge concentration of data centers in one particular county in Virginia, which are going to, again, in the aggregate, increase demand. So that's one trend. Next trend. These are forecasted retirements between 2022 and 2030. So I would think of PJM as about a 180,000 megawatt system. So if you see the gray there, what the gray will represent to you is that by the end of this decade, our forecasted retirements, based primarily on policy considerations and some economics, we are expecting 40 gigawatts of our system, 40 gigawatts to be retired by the end of this decade. It's a significant chunk of power. Please.
In one instance, you're talking about megawatts, and then you're talking about gigawatts.
Oh, sorry.
For the committee, you said that your system is 180,000 megawatts.
Yeah. Why don't we call it 185, about 180 gigawatts.
Yes,
Let's call it 180 gigawatts, and we expect for about 40 gigawatts. And there's a difference here. You see the number 192 GW. I want to use, there's differences between installed, there's differences between capacity, there's differences between energy, but let's just use the number 180. And then we are forecasting out towards the end of this decade the loss of 40 of those 180 as a result of, again, primarily policy and some economic considerations. I would say this is a very conservative estimate, actually, and I say that for a couple of reasons. One, because a large coal plant in Pennsylvania announced its retirement, and that was not a unit that was on our radar. And so it's take that 40 gigawatt number and add those watts to that 40. And then the other is there's currently a proposed rule from the federal EPA on GHG emissions that could also serve to create sort of more policy retirements. We'll have to reevaluate once that rule becomes final to see how much more there would be, so 40 plus effectively. This is the last trend that I'll show you, which is, so where are we right now? Where are we in the trend count here? So again, increased demand, supply being reduced because of our forecasted retirements. So then the natural thought is, well, just replace those resources with new resources. And the predicament that we find ourselves in right now is we've got a lot of, again, primarily solar, wind, hybrid, some natural gas resources in our queue. It's 90+% is solar, wind, hybrid resource, battery resource. And our new entry, so the steel in the ground of a solar facility, wind facility, paired with a battery or battery standalone, our new entry is not going to keep up with the pace of retirements. So then the math becomes relatively simple. So we have particular number of a gigawatt system today. We're forecasting pretty significant retirements towards the end of this decade, and we are not seeing new entry match the rate of retirements. That, our concern, is the middle concern. So we'll go through the far left and far right columns as well, but we've spent a lot of time on that middle concern, that middle reliability trend. So again, just reading for you now, generation retirements may outpace new entry with a simultaneous likelihood of load increasing, thereby creating resource adequacy concerns. Will we have enough watts? That's the first concern that we've discussed, and that's the middle concern there. Two more items to discuss, and we'll hit them very briefly. Go ahead, please.
Okay.
Chairman.
I think is part of the reason that we're concerned about not having enough replacement is that when you're replacing assets that are baseload generation that are, let's say, 85% efficient, have fuel sources on site, and you're trying to replace those with something that may have an efficiency rating of 18% or whatever, that doesn't generate all the time, like wind and solar. If you're replacing 100, let's say 700 megawatts, well, even if you replace 700 megawatts with 700 megawatts of wind or solar, that still doesn't equate because they're not available all the time.
It's a great point.
And I think that's one of the problems that
Yeah.
I've been trying to convey is that it's not the same.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let me talk about that a little bit, and we'll then naturally go to our far right column because I think that in part addresses your concern. So the first item to discuss about sort of the difference between the coal, gas, nuclear watts. We call those thermal resources as sort of a term of art. Those are thermal resources. The difference between those sort of watts and watts that are generated from renewable facilities, it's worthwhile to discuss. And the first is that the sort of capacity values will be different for each. And, of all of those watts that we're talking about, nuclear has a very, very high, we'll call them capacity value, just for simplicity. We'll call it capacity value. And then depending on the coal asset and how fuel secure it is, or the gas asset and whether it has pipeline redundancy or firm contracting, the capacity values are all quite different for these resources. Generally speaking, solar and wind are on the lower end of those capacity values. So that's one item to think about. And we are in the process we actually have sort of created this accreditation dynamic where every resource should be accredited its maximum, it should be credited its capacity value and when it participates within PJM. And so we're in the process of sort of creating that. I don't want to get too down in the weeds with that, but that's a very good point. But I also think not only just this sort of capacity value issue, if you look at the far right, I think another item of note that we just have to take note of is there is, the grid is a machine. And machines operate through principles of science, physics in particular. There are, as identified by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, there are certain physical properties of the grid that currently thermal resources provide. And they are qualities like frequency, inertia, ramp, voltage control. These are all items that, again, this entity has identified, again, tasked with maintaining reliability by the federal government, that this entity has identified are being essential to maintaining reliability for the system. Currently, this is a study that we did as well, one message to convey is we can't simply shut down all thermal resources and replace them with non-thermal resources, because those thermal resources provide, again, essential reliability services. The sort of spinning mass element of these resources provide the necessary grid physics to allow for electrons to get from point A to point B. So that's another just point to make, which is we have, physics and physical differences between these types of resources, and that's what the far right item effectively conveys. Far left item, and we'll just talk about it very briefly, is around this what happened during Winter Storm Elliott. And during Winter Storm Elliott, PJM system, it's got a diverse generation fleet with a strong reserve margin. We had enough watts. We certainly had enough watts with enough essential units with enough essential reliability services. But those units didn't perform. And so the way we view our reliability concerns on a going forward basis is this is purely education for the legislature. We view them in sort of a timeline. And we view the immediate concern as, if you've got enough watts and you've got sort of the right composition of watts, your generators have to perform when you call on them. And so that is the immediate term concern, is we need to support generator performance. But later on into this decade, we are concerned about a supply crunch, concerned about resources leaving the system too quickly and new resources not finding their way onto the system at a rate to replace those resources leaving the system. And so that is the concept of, do you have enough watts? Do you have enough resources? Do you have resource adequacy? So we need to ensure resource adequacy. Then the last bucket here on the right is what Chairman Gooch brought up and what we talked about with respect to having enough essential reliability services. Not all resources are the same. Some resources provide these essential reliability services. Right now, that's our thermal resources, nuclear, coal, gas. So we need to maintain a certain amount of essential reliability services, units that provide essential reliability services, and also attract new, right? Part of what PJM is trying to do is maintain reliability that's also cost effective. So, we aren't in the business of keeping plants that are uneconomical, around in perpetuity. We want to create an environment where innovators, whether it's small modular reactors or hydrogen, want to come and interconnect into the system to replace those resources. So it's not just about maintaining, it's about attracting new technologies as well. So what are we doing about it? It's great to sort of raise the red flag, but we've got to do something about it as well. And so the PJM team, we've spent quite a bit of time, again, we're primarily an engineering firm, economics firm. So what have we done? We have spent a considerable amount of time analyzing, and we are crafting solutions. And so we have come up with, what we deem to be sort of 16 critical actions that we plan to take in order to preserve reliability and alleviate some of those concerns that we referenced in the long run. And I just wanted to direct your attention. If you just go to pjm.com and you were to look at the front page of pjm.com, you would see that there is a link to what we're calling our reliability initiative, ensuring a reliable energy transition. We're not trying to fight the idea that there are generators that want to interconnect into the system. We're just trying to ensure that we maintain reliability when these generators are entering the system and we're seeing resources leave the system. It's effectively the goal. And if you were to click on that web page, you will see all of the different actions that we propose to take in order to try and preserve reliability as we advance through the transition. Again, we're in the early stages. We're in the early stages. PJM is not in the sort of hot zone of the heat map that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation pushed out. In fact, we had some really hot weather in the PJM footprint last week. We were able to navigate that very successfully. We were able to, in fact, help our neighbors. It's a chunk of the footprint that is in the Mid-Continent ISO. We were able to help them. And that's actually one of the benefits of being part of the Eastern Interconnect and being part of the RTO framework. With that, hopefully, I was able to articulate some of the concerns that we're seeing. And again, this is our sort of opportunity to come to you all and say, just talk about what we do, and also talk about some of the concerns that we are seeing, and tell you we are here as a resource. Should you need anything from us, information, data, etc., happy to be of assistance. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Senator Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few questions, if you would indulge me. Sir, I guess one of the promises made by people pushing renewables is that this is going to reduce costs, make a cleaner environment, and be a benefit to consumers. Now, I've done a little bit of research, and in 2004, the average Kentucky Power customer was paying about $74 a month. Now they're paying about $187.50, which is about a 250% increase, which is, I understand there's some inflation in there, but that's far outpaces inflation. And now, they're seeking another 18% increase. So I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, when are we as consumers going to see the benefits of these new resources? Because it doesn't seem like they're helping the middle class or the people that live in these areas. This transition is helping them at all.
Yeah, and Chair, to the Senator, the first thing to sort of think about or acknowledge here, right now, in the PJM footprint, the Kentucky split, you've generally got, 50+% coal resources, 40+% natural gas resources. So I have not, at least in the PJM footprint, we have not seen many renewables find their way into the system again, at least in the PJM component of the PJM footprint in Kentucky. I think that when we're talking about just bill pay, we are very conscious of, as are our member utilities, because part of their mission also is to try and deliver reliable power that is affordable for consumers. We are very conscientious of this. We have operated relatively conservative in that regard. There are, headlines across the country related to transmission spend.
So you're saying we ought to be grateful for 250%, not 500%?
Oh, I'm not saying anybody should be grateful about anything. But I did want to point out, at least in the bulk power sphere, on the generation side and the transmission side, what we would really control would be transmission, the regional transmission that is constructed, and those costs. And again, what I would say there is that we have been we are generally viewed as, from a regional planning perspective, at least nationally right now, as pretty conservative in how much transmission from a regional perspective we will build in order to sort of advance through this transition.
Well, I think you kind of bring up a valid point. I guess a lot of this transition, a lot of these increases are often blamed on fuel costs. And as you've shown on your graph, I think there's been a significant transition from coal to natural gas and now into other things in the last 19 years. So I think the chairman has stated many times that when he was a youngster, natural gas was considered a precious resource that you wouldn't just waste on
Sure.
ordinary generation. How much of this increase can be related to that? And I guess the second part of that question, if you're saying that we're being conservative in our transition from fossils to renewables, can we expect more drastic price increases like what we've seen in the next 10 to 15 years as you take these other resources offline.
Yeah, Senator, I think the first point to make about where PJM sits in the whole sphere of what customers pay for power is we have nothing to do with distribution rates that presumably the local PSC will determine for every individual utility. On the generation side, you are also not deregulated, so we don't have anything also to do. I don't want to say anything because there is some market interplay, but we don't regulate the cost, or we don't. Our markets are not dictating the cost that your consumers will pay for generation either. So really, when you're talking about purely cost and PJM, primarily there is some interplay on the
You're here
generation
as an
side for
information
benchmarking.
resource. Who's
Yeah,
dictating the cost?
yeah.
It's not you.
On the generation side and the distribution side,
Absolutely, both.
I would presume it is the Kentucky PSC.
The Kentucky PSC is dictating the cost. They're dictating the transition off of fossils to renewables.
Not the transition from fossil to renewables, but at least for the approved amount that can be charged to consumers for generation and distribution. Yes.
Senator, if I can interrupt, I think one issue that we have to maybe look at a little harder here is we had a fossil fuel coal-fired power plant closed down, and there might have been replaced with some natural gas, but I think a lot of that generation was replaced by another coal-fired power plant in another state, and we may need to look at how much of this cost is contributed to that. I just want to interject that. Go ahead if you.
No, I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. But I guess maybe as a controller of the entire grid in this area of the country, when is the consumer going to see price decreases from renewables?
Yeah, Senator, that's a great question. We currently do not have a significant proliferation of renewables in the PJM footprint. Again, it's under 10%. And so we are monitoring and will continue to monitor the price of power as more renewables find their way into the system. There will be different dynamics at play. For instance, with renewable facilities, you've got sort of your initial capital costs, but your going forward fuel costs are sunlight and the wind, right? So there is a reduction in what could be pricing because there's no going forward fuel costs. Simultaneously, there is a cost associated with not being able to maintain reliable power delivery. And that's a cost as well. There's a cost to local economies. There's a cost to regional economies if the power system does not deliver, and we have prolonged brownouts, blackouts, etc. So there are a number of different factors to look at when thinking about the integration of renewable resources onto the system as it pertains to cost. Surely to reduce emissions, but on the cost front, we'll continue to monitor the integration of renewables and its interplay sort of into our market sphere.
If you take the government subsidies out, which some of us argue is a hidden cost, is the worst yet to come as far as what the cost is going to be to consumers on electricity with the additional closure of fossil plants, particularly coal plants, in the next decade?
Yeah, Senator, it's tough to tell with all the variables. But certainly cost is certainly something that we are transparent about, keep tabs on, and will continue to interact with you all as to the trends that we are seeing. But you're right. I mean, there are significant, whether it's federal support or state support for particular facilities, and it's actually the case across our footprint. In fact, we've got in one of our deregulated states, we've got actually support that is being provided to a couple coal plants as well. So it is not outside of the realm of the possible to see some of those sort of support mechanisms just beyond the renewable facilities in our footprint. So we see them for nuclear facilities as well. But you are right. The certainly the Investment Reduction, or excuse me, the Inflation Reduction Act, and widely speaking, just generally, the primary sort of state support that we see, really across the country is for the build out of renewable facilities.
So how do you value renewable generation capacity?
How do we value it? The capacity, we ascribe a particular capacity value to each type of renewable facility. That effectively creates here's how much you can obtain from that particular marketplace, and then those renewable resources can participate in other markets at PJM as well. We have short-term and long-term duration markets, and the sort of net sum of those markets will create the overall value that the renewable facilities receive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
All right. Let's also not forget the cost of the lack of reliability has on public health and safety as well.
Sure.
Representative Blanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sir, I'd like to refer to slide 11 on your forecasted retirement capacity.
Yes.
Now, I don't know what the 2022 announced, how much of that is policy, how much is economic, but I do see here that policy is going to be about 24 of the gigawatts compared to maybe 3.5 or so due to economic, and which tells me that this loss of gigawatts is happening because of policy decisions, which means policy decisions much like they're making in Illinois, where they're pushing to go totally fossil fuel free. It's the shutdown of these plants that's providing, as your own you've stated and your own slides show, the vast majority of our reliable electricity is coming from fossil fuels. So what I would like to start with, my first question is this: are you concerned that the continuing of these type of policies and the retirement of these baseload plants is going to endanger the stability of our grid, particularly in periods of time when we have very high demand, much like the winter storm Elliott? And thankfully, we don't live, or we might get some real warm weather, but we don't see what they're seeing for extended periods as they are in Arizona. So are you concerned about that?
Representative, thank you for the question. We are. We are concerned about that. And again, I think we're concerned about that on sort of, two different fronts. I think we're concerned about that, in the near term with this concept of just making sure that we have enough watts to power the system. And that's all watts, right? That includes renewable watts as well. And that is sort of a later in this decade event that, again, we're going to lead to try and solve that conundrum. We've got to, ensure that as we are conducting our education, that folks understand, when we're pushing resources off of the system, what that means, right? And that we are doing what we can to bring new resources onto the system as expeditiously as possible. We just went through a really protracted interconnection queue reform process, slightly amended by the FERC recently, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, but, that's part of the formula as well. And, this when we're just purely talking about thermal resources, which are, again, nuclear, coal, and gas, I really think that pertains to this upcoming concern, which is this is sort of to just generalize forecast out, and we're seeing as a mid-2030s type of issue, where will we have enough resources that are providing these essential reliability services, again, physical grid properties, on the system in order to continue to maintain reliable power delivery. And that could be the thermal resources that exist today, or some new technology that we need to also, want to incent to come onto the system because of their ability to support reliability. And so, again, this is not PJM Interconnection coming here saying, we need to save this type of unit or that type of unit or another type of unit. This is just saying, here are the physical properties that are necessary for the grid. Here are the types of units that can provide them today. And there hopefully will be new additional technologies that are under development. Some of them get a lot of coverage today, and I'm sure there are others that are out there that we don't know about. But that will also find their way to the system because, again, you also want to try and provide. You also want to provide this service at a cost that's affordable for consumers too. And so, there's this, we don't want to create this dynamic where there are units that are just have hit the end of their useful life as machines. And we are effectively trying to sort of keep them around in some level of perpetuity, and it's costly to maintain them. So that's, attracting new resources to the system is also important to us as well.
Well, you can't sit here and say it today, but I will sit here and say it today because I can. And that is the fact that these policies is destroying our grid that is provided across this country every time they shut down one of these fossil fuel plants. And those of us that are awakened and see through the smog, we understand that is an attempt to shut down all of our fossil fuels, which provides the most reliable, the cheapest form of energy that we can provide to our customers, to our constituents, to our citizens out there. So my next question along those lines with the way that the grid is set up and the recklessness of some of these states with their policies trying to eliminate fossil fuels, which just blows my mind. But so what happens in a peak time period? Let's go back to Winter Storm Elliott.
Sure.
In a situation like that where we have a high demand for electricity because of the cold, and you're on the grid and we've got this area and we're providing a good form of dependable, reliable electricity here in Kentucky. But what about these states that aren't? I know you all sharing power across those grids. You're rationing power. Why should Kentuckians be forced to bear the brunt of the poor decisions of these other states to keep their lights on by using brownouts and blackouts and those type things when it's because of their poor decisions? Why is it then that Kentuckians should have to bear the brunt of that?
Representative, I don't know that we know that Kentuckians are going to bear the brunt. Obviously we've got a 14 state footprint, and I would say that first thing I'd say is that part of what we try to educate policymakers that are interested in advancing decarbonization policies is around this concept of reliability and trying to create, we'll call them like reliability safety valves, in the event that a unit is supposed to leave the system, or if in the event you've said, hey, you coal unit, you can only run for so much time during the year. If we need those units in order to preserve reliability, we've tried to build into those policies, like we have done in Illinois, actually, sort of these reliability safety measures. The other thing, and I should mention, is that currently there is the ability, if a unit says it wants to retire, if we then run, it's called a sort of deactivation analysis, and removal of that unit would show that it is going to create reliability challenges. We can and reliability challenges until we can, build transmission effectively to sort of alleviate that reliability challenge. We can ask the unit to stick around to continue to provide power. I think your broader question is around, that's called reliability must run. I think your broader question is around, hey, there are all these states with all these policies that are pushing units off of the system. A couple thoughts, which is that, so let's say we do get to the situation, in fact, where where we have, what is effectively a system where we've got few baseload, or we'll call them thermal units, and quite a few renewable units. Certainly, I would agree with you that those baseload units could be utilized more to provide power to the rest of the footprint. But what I would also say about that is, to the extent that you want those resources to be around and they are generating power and they are providing it to consumers, that is effectively, rather than sort of taxing for consumers, that's revenue that they're deriving to actually provide that power to consumers. And the other thing is, we were actually just in Ohio yesterday and had this conversation with their government as well. To the extent that you're sort of open for business for the construction of new generation that can help to provide reliability, it's good for economic development as well. So I think, while you could be supporting other states through the power that you generate, conceivably, right? Because we don't know until we get there. There then would be, an opportunity, frankly, for economic growth for those states who are still willing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Hawk, has there been any talks about maybe a reliability surcharge or something to the effect that at some point, we in Kentucky, our PSC always looks at what they claim to be the lowest cost scenario and maintaining reliability and the cheapest cost. But at some point, if you have to pay a little bit extra for reliability, has there been any discussion of that?
It's a great question. So, currently we're looking at measures to bolster reliability in operations, in planning, and in markets, sort of our three core business functions. And so, with vertically integrated states, utilities submit what are called integrated resource plans to their commissions. And they say, here's what we're going to utilize to try and provide power to our consumers, and we're going to build in, some reserve margin as well. That's sort of the integrated resource plan process. So there's sort of that, there's that kind of oversight or overview there. In the deregulated states, we've got our, what's called a capacity market to try and procure, resource adequacy for the future, try and procure enough resources to maintain reliability in the future. And so, we are not contemplating a surcharge per se, but what we're contemplating is markets reform to try and ensure that the markets are working to maintain reliability. And could those reforms result in reforms result in an increase in cost for the deregulated states that participate in the capacity market? It could, but I think we are in the sort of headspace now where all of our core business functions need to function in order to try and make reliability work. And so, to your point, Chairman, it's not a surcharge per se, but as we sort of evolve our core business practices of markets and planning and operations, we need to make sure that they work to support reliability.
Okay. Mr. Hawk, let me ask you, do you have another meeting that you have to go to this evening?
I'm here at your leisure, please.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And this has been a good discussion, but we have almost 10 people asking to speak. So what I would ask is that you ask one question and make sure that you go through the chair because we want everybody's questions to be answered. We appreciate the opportunity to ask them. We don't get this opportunity a lot, but please be mindful of time. So Representative Dossett. Okay. Representative Wesley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I heard about the reliable resources here and also our coal plants being shut down like in Pennsylvania and throughout our nation. Quick question, will the risk of blackouts continue in Kentucky in the Commonwealth if we continue shutting our coal plants down?
I think the risk of not having resource adequacy later on into this decade will increase the risk of potential shedding load, which is effectively, asking customers to, or in fact, in some instances, forcing those outages in order to preserve overall system reliability. I do think that increases the risk unless we've got adequate replacement.
Representative Smith?
Let's follow up on the point that he just made. Would it not be simpler for us to look at a longer-term shutdown plan rather than the fast track that we're seeing on your, I consider 8 years fast track or 7 years fast track. Would it not be simpler to, since it is it heightens the degree of blackouts by shutting the power of the coal generation plants down? Wouldn't it be simpler to look at a 20, 25, 30-year model rather than, and honestly, I appreciate the position that you're in. You're the middle person, but you're the one that's going to take the heat on the blackouts.
For sure.
So, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you having them here because you're actually the one that's going to have to answer for it.
Yep.
And it's coming, and you know it's coming, because of the decrease of our power, the coal generation plants, and the reliability on renewable energy it's not going to be sufficient. When you're forced to look at electric cars, more electric grid, you've got a double whammy coming. And all we're asking, or I'm asking, is for you to really, I don't know if you have lobbyists in your company. I don't know how you deal with Washington, but I can tell you here in Frankfurt, our interest is having electric at the cheapest rate.
Yep.
And we have had people sit there, Mr. Chairman, and tell us that coal generation plants is the most reliable and cheapest form of electric grid. So I don't even know why you have to be put in this position, but you are. It's on you. And I'm just saying, you better look at a longer-term model. I like hybrid cars. I think we should do a transition to hybrid cars before we go electric. But that's just my opinion. But I'm just making the statement that in 4 or 5 years, when you're sitting in front of us, or maybe 3 years or 2-year period, explaining how the blackout happened, and as Representative Blanton said, there's no doubt in my mind if there's another state on your footprint that runs out of electric, you're not going to pull from where you have to pull from. That's business, and you'll have to do that. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've talked a little bit too long, but my advice is we're on your side on finding the cheapest way of doing it, but we're also on the side of fossil. I am on utilizing our fossil fuels here in Kentucky.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative. Senator Southworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier you mentioned that other locations in the country had, I think, elevated risk.
Yep.
2/3 or something. We were talking about likelihoods of issues, shortfalls, and whatever. And PJM is not in the elevated risk category. Can you describe what risk category that PJM is in, and then perhaps if you have a general idea on where other regional groups are, so where are we in the whole mix nationwide?
Yeah, sure. So, first, Senator, we will send you that report that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation put out, because what I'll say won't do justice to actually their words and their graphics. There are regions in the country that are, quote, at highly elevated risk of having to shed load when the weather gets really hot this summer. It was a summer assessment that they did. Again, PJM is not in that highly elevated zone, and I don't recall if we were given a designation, just outside of that, but we're not in that highly elevated zone. Within the Commonwealth, and I want to turn to my colleague, if I recall correctly, the Mid-Continent ISO is in that highly elevated zone. And then what about TVA? Do we recall? I do not recall TVA employment. Okay, we will get back to you on that particular piece. But Kentucky is very unique in that your whole state, your state is actually, you've got a few different grid operators, depending on where you are jurisdictionally. Again, we cover the footprint of EKPC, Duke, and Kentucky Power.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Gentry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Hague, for coming in. And I'm not going to beat you down on rates, but my question is a little different than everybody else's. And I guess in conversations and modern day conversations of clean energy, so on, I'm hearing this word hydrogen. And it seems to be very controversial. I'm hearing pros, cons, potential. And just today, if you want to add any kind of comment at all from your perspective of what you might know, offer anything you'd like, but hydrogen. I've been asking everybody I know about that recently, and I'm interested to see what your response would be. Thank you.
Sure. So we know that hydrogen is a technology that is currently sort of in R&D phase with a number of our member companies. And all our position is with respect to hydrogen is if you can assist in providing power and you can assist in providing reliable power, we'd love to have you. Okay, but part of, and again, we'll get back to the far right reliability concern, deployable at scale. And so to Representative Smith's point, we have today is for PJM interconnection legislative testimony number 14 in 2023. Our boss actually testified to very similar effect at the U.S. Senate on June the 1st. So we are being very vocal about where we view the transition and where PJM is effectively positioned in this transition. And we get a lot of questions. I've gotten quite a few questions about, well, just put a bunch of small modular nuclear reactors in the system and we're good. And my response is, we would love that. But at present, I don't believe the first small modular reactor is expected to actually be online and produce power until later in this decade. And so we need resources that are deployable at scale in order to meet this sort of reliability challenge on the essential reliability services piece. So my general response as representing a grid operator that provides bulk power for part of the Commonwealth is we would be happy to incorporate hydrogen into the system. It's got to go through the R&D phase. It's got to be safe. If it can preserve reliability cost effectively and is deployable at scale, we'd love to have it. Sorry if I can't provide more, but on R&D and sort of resource type, we're generally agnostic. We're just looking for enough power and the right characteristics.
Thank you. Senator Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if anybody would have told this former underground coal miner 40 years ago that she'd be on the nuclear task force, I'd have thought they were on something. But anyway, that's where we are. And we do have a nuclear task force now, and we are working towards that possibility. But I'm like you. It's a little far out, and we're going to need things now. And my question is, if the anticipated shortages occur, if whether it's a storm or whatever, on your grid, who you serve, what area, what demographic, do you have any anticipated, like who's going to go first, who's going to be browned out, who's going to be blacked out? I've got a lot of poor rural people, and I've got some major users like a refinery in my district, okay? So we've got, in East Kentucky, where we are used to having plenty of power at a pretty good rate, when we look at anticipation of a failure or brownout, blackout, total out, whatever the case may be, do we have any projected models as to the demographic that would be affected first or the most in case of certain scenarios?
Senator, wonderful question. We wouldn't shut if there were a situation, and in our recent history, we have not had such a situation. We did have one in June of last year, specifically in the Columbus, Ohio area, because of downed transmission lines as a result of a derecho that came through and knocked down a bunch of transmission lines, weather-related and tree-related, frankly, outages that created a forced outage situation in that Columbus area. And so, Senator, it will be very sort of specific as to, what is necessary for the engineering of the grid. Okay. And so we wouldn't select, hey, you're going to be out based on sort of demographics of end use customers or anything like that. In fact, we don't even deal on the retail side. So we don't know what customer is based where. That's for our distribution utilities. Really what we know is here's what the overall big picture of the grid looks like from a generation and a transmission perspective. But as far as sort of the demographics of the end use customers, it's just not something that we deal in or even know about. It would, if it happened, and again, outside of like that one very specific instance in our recent history, it has not. It would be based upon the engineering of the grid and what was necessary to keep the bulk of the grid sort of viable, would not be based on types of customer.
Well, the area is a concern to me too.
Sure.
Vulnerable populations, and East Kentucky's got a history of being on the back end.
Understood.
So my concern would be if there had to be a decision made as to who would bear the burden of certain scenarios, whether man-made or natural occurrences. If they had flexibility in that determination, what would the criteria be, and who would be most at risk?
It would all be engineering based, unfortunately. So I don't have a great answer for you, but that is effectively the answer. So, but I think one thing to know is we do work closely with our transmission owners, who generally speaking then have the distribution utility that is a affiliate or subsidiary, and so we do work closely. And so, would there be the ability to work with them to kind of have an understanding? If we say, hey, this region needs to be out, can you work conceivably distribution utility to maybe rotate the outages so that people don't experience, prolonged or, just based upon where the area is situated? I think one of the challenges, and this is just a lesson learned from that June outage of last year, is that when you kind of stray from the engineering and you start to get into kind of the people-centric component of the situation, it can get pretty sort of dangerous, right? And get pretty dicey. Like who should be out? Like I think in that situation there were a lot of questions about who was out and why, and eventually I think the Public Utilities Commission in Ohio, as well as the media, were pretty well assured that it was just engineering based at the end of the day. So, but you ask a really great question. It's always important to know that at the end of all of this, there are people, and it's certainly something that's part of. We are a mission-driven organization. We effectively operate as a nonprofit. We have our rates on file with the FERC if, we get our budget basically approved every year. And, if we spend under that amount, then that money goes back to the membership and consumer pockets. And so we're pretty mission driven, keeping the lights on, thinking about people. So I think your concern is very well stated.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Burke?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for this presentation, which I think has been, no pun intended, quite enlightening.
Good.
My question relates to what I'm perceiving as somewhat of a gap, because right now we have our current power system. We have a clear transition that we're making, and the whole spirit of your presentation is on that transition to the future, which is, for many in this room, unfortunately not coal power plants. Do you have a recommendation for states like Kentucky, which historically have derived a great benefit from having coal as one of our featured industries, for this interim transition? Or is it, as you were saying to Rep. Gentry earlier, you all sort of frankly don't care where the energy comes from so long as it comes until we make the transition to other thermal things, perhaps nuclear and other renewables?
Representative, I think the answer is yes. We are sort of resource agnostic in that regard. And it's not that we don't care. And I want to, be clear that we definitely have an understanding that state and local economies are reliant, for instance, on, particular fuels. I'm actually from the state of Ohio, and so I understand the economics of regions and coal, specifically Appalachia. I understand also the economics around the shale gas revolution and the jobs that were created there. And so, very sympathetic to those concerns. I think as the grid operator, again, we do look at this from a more engineering perspective, and specifically, we will need thermal resources, right? We will need thermal resources until, those resources can be replaced again at scale. And so we don't see that technology being integrated into the system, certainly not tomorrow. Right. And so we will continue to need our thermal resources. And, I'll say what I said to Ohio, just yesterday, which is, you're well positioned in the sense that we're going to continue to need, some amount of these thermal resources, and you have them, right? So that's sort of thing one. And then thing two is, and sort of in response to the representative who's left the room, is, if you were still open for business for, resources beyond solar and wind, there's an opportunity there as well. And so I do, just objectively, and, again, I would say this to sort of your state or a state that's similarly situated, I do think there's opportunity. I think there's economic growth opportunity, economics, sustaining and growth in a state like the Commonwealth of Kentucky.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you start off your presentation with, and by the way, thank you for the presentation.
Sure.
It's awesome. You start off your presentation talking about trends. One of the trends you talked about is the forecasted retirement of generation capabilities, generation sources. And I believe you said that was a conservative estimate on your part. I strongly agree with that. I suspect it might get much worse with the trends we have going right now. And you also talked about the increase in demand, increase in load. And if I remember right, you felt like that was a pretty conservative estimate too. Is that fair to say that?
Yeah, electrification, the load forecasts, we are consistently updating them because, you may not know of all the data centers that are going to exist in the footprint by 2037, right? So we're going to pretty consistently update these forecasts. We try and build in a sort of mathematical trajectory of how we think the industries are going to evolve, but I don't know if the load growth forecast is conservative, but certainly we think the forecasted retirements forecast is conservative as we sit here today. But the load growth forecasts will just need to be updated with greater consistency. Is my answer to that?
Okay, so this is my question. This
Sure.
is actually my question. And our responsibility here is to protect our citizens in Kentucky. Given the projection you have for retirement of sources and the projection you have for load increase, at this crunch time you're talking about in the 2030s, in your professional opinion as a subject matter expert,
Sure.
I'm making this as soft as I can. Do you feel that with the 16-point plan that you mentioned, that your agency feels confident that we will be able to provide the energy we need to provide given the reduced production and the increased load? Do you feel confident we're going to be able to avoid the things we talk about here, blackouts, brownouts, load shifts to protect other states? Do you feel confident that you will be able to do that given the trends that you're seeing?
Representative, I can't say with certainty. I do know that we have, again, a bit more time than some of our compatriot grid operators in the country. So we have a bit more time. We're observing to see what they're doing. We're trying to learn lessons from what they're doing and then apply those to sort of our unique situation. All these grids are different. Like each one of these, 9 of these in North America, they're all different. They all have their sort of own resource mix. They all have their individual states and policy priorities. I will say PJM, I think, is also well situated to Senator Southworth's question around the elevated risk because we are so diverse. Okay, we really are a diverse footprint. We've got states like Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky. They're still very much concerned about their coal economies. We have states, again, like Ohio and West Virginia, Pennsylvania, that sit on top of the shale play. We've got states that are advancing aggressive decarbonization, and that being coupled with sort of the vertically integrated model versus the deregulated model. In some ways, the vertically integrated model, while we like competitive markets and we advocate for markets, the vertically integrated model can also be helpful to promoting reliability because rather than rely on a market construct to determine resource adequacy, your locality, your state PSC can do that. And so I think the diversity of the footprint gives us a fighting chance. But the variables that, a real variable that is just impossible today to sit here and contemplate how it lands is the variable around technology development. It's just impossible to say today because, look, if 20 years ago we were to have this conversation, so let's call it 2003, we would have not anticipated the shale play. And 20 years ago, PJM was a predominantly coal-based footprint. We would not have been able to anticipate the shale play. And so I don't know whether Representative Gentry's hydrogen or, small modular nuclear reactor, Senator Webb, I'm sure you'll be discussing that in your task force. I don't know what that thing will be, but we just want to be really, really prepared and really conservative if that new technology is 2 decades away as opposed to 6 years away. We want to raise the concerns because, as has been very artfully articulated, if the lights go out, I'll be back here saying hello, and there'll be a different conversation had. And so hence, us coming out and, really trying to get out to our state legislatures to have these discussions. So the variable of new technology, really hard to figure out right now where that's going to land. I'd say the other variable, and, I want to couch this sort of these comments in these terms. Our queue consists of primarily, again, solar, wind, and battery resources. Okay, that indicates that the grid will get greener. Right, the grid will get greener just based upon the composition of what is in our generation interconnection queue, and it's sort of fact. Okay, but a variable that we're not sure about right now is how much actual renewable generation is going to leave our queue and construct. Because I'll give you a statistic that we haven't talked about yet, but it's important, which is, currently we have a lot of generation that is out of PJM's queue, has nothing left to do with PJM interconnection. You've got what you need from us, okay? And that number's high. It's 48,000, it's 48 gigs. Okay, so remember, we talked about our concern about 40 gigs retiring by the end of this decade. And currently, we have 48 gigs that have found their way through all things PJM and are waiting to construct. Okay, but we are not seeing the steel in the ground. And it's primarily due to the reasons that we are given. After they get done with PJM, they have no reporting obligation to us. But what are the reasons that we're hearing? We're hearing about supply chain problems. We are hearing about siting problems. We are hearing about financing problems and some sort of counterintuitive impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act. These are all things that are out of our control. And so a variable that we cannot yet, variable that we just don't know enough about yet is how much of this generation that is in the queue and finds their way through the queue, how much of this generation is actually going to get built? And we don't have that answer right now. Last year was a pretty pitiful 2 gigs. And 1,300 of it was a natural gas plant in Ohio. 700 of it was renewable.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean
No,
to cut
that's
you
it.
off, but
That's it.
and I do appreciate your answer. I'm going to summarize for probably the majority of this committee. I heard no. I know you can't use that word.
Shall
but
not
that's what I
confirm nor
heard.
deny. No, thank you. Thank you for
Exactly.
your question.
One brief comment, follow up, finish. If we didn't have the combined emphasis of electrifying everything we possibly can, from our cars to our stoves and our kitchens, combined with an incredible effort to destroy our coal industries and our natural gas industries, we would not be having this meeting right now. We would not need to have this meeting right now. And if we don't change at least one of those trends in some way, the answer to the question that I asked this gentleman is going to be absolutely not. We have got to look at reality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Representative Flannery.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a two-part question, please. Thank you, sir. Most of the people that have said, and the chair that you're sitting in today, have been asked a similar question. Their answer is typically no, or some variant of that. We have this current shift to electric vehicles. Can we handle the load, the usage that it's going to put on our grid? And do we have the generational capacity as we get to this projected point of electrical vehicles?
Yeah, Representative, I would answer it in a very similar way that I answered Representative Johnson, which is we don't know yet, but we are concerned that with increased electrification and increased retirements, so these trends that we're seeing, that we may not have enough. But we don't know for sure, which is why we're sort of presenting the concern and again saying that we're going to take action, to try and resolve that concern. But it's important for policymakers across our footprint to understand that we are in fact concerned. But I can't say definitively yes or no.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Certainly.
As policymakers, as lawmakers, any advice as to what we can do to make sure that we can handle that load and this projected shift, and that we do have the generational capacity to serve Kentucky and the more frequent usage of the grid as people plug in their vehicles at night before they go to bed and get their vehicles charged.
So this is a bit of a unique circumstance for me in that, generally speaking, when I'm asked that question by policymakers, the policymaker has an idea of, I want to advance some kind of decarbonization legislation. How can I do it while keeping the grid reliable? And our response is typically, the grid is a machine, and it requires deep engineering and scientific analysis before policy is advanced. Let us help. If you don't want us to be the primary folks, let us help conduct some of that analysis to assist in that sort of policy making. I think in this particular circumstance, and this is obviously a different venue, I would just continue to keep reliability at the forefront of all energy policy that is crafted on behalf of this body, as well as cost. Certainly, cost is very, very important to consumers. We also believe it's very, very important to consumers. So just my kind of broad thought, or my sort of the sort of summation of all the education done today is, with all things that the body does, just thinking about reliability and using us as a resource to the extent that we can help you.
Would fossils and thermals help with the reliability factor?
Thermal resources, we are going to need thermal resources in order to preserve reliability until replacement tech exists to deploy at scale.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Wheeler, do you have anything else?
Just briefly, you stated earlier you think the PSC is responsible for increasing power costs. I mean, it's my understanding one of the biggest drivers of Kentucky power costs are transmission costs approved by FERC that the PSC does not have authority to deny. And a lot of these investments are in fact occurring out of state and aren't even regional and have nothing to do with Kentucky. What has PJM done to drive down supplemental transmission spending, which I think constitutes about a sixth of the power cost in the area where I live?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so local transmission projects or supplemental projects, those are built out at the decision of the local utility. They are allocated cost-wise based upon formulas that have been approved by the FERC. What we do in this space, because we have not been vested with the authority to sort of locally plan in the same way that we regionally plan, what we do is we've got a stakeholder process. So it's a process that is public, that individuals, you don't have to be a member of PJM to tune into these stakeholder processes. So what we have done, and actually the FERC has said, hey, we in certain dockets, look at PJM's model, is we've created a venue where stakeholders and transmission owners, specifically transmission owners, come to and present the local projects that they plan to construct. Questions are asked of the transmission owners around, the sort of parameters of those projects. What is it? The whys, and that currently is the authority that we've been vested with to try and shed some transparency around those local project that local project development and spend, but you are correct in that those are not regionally planned by PJM, and the cost allocation has been determined by the
From my
FERC.
understanding, even the PSC has gone to PJM and tried to encourage them to reduce these supplemental costs on Kentucky consumers and has been somewhat unsuccessful. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think there was a protracted sort of piece of litigation around this topic, and the FERC eventually adjudicated the matter and sort of said, here's where we are, and here's where we are is what I described to you. And so I think part of where PJM is positioned on this is we don't know the local systems. Again, we're bulk power grid. We don't know the local systems like the local transmission owners and utilities will know the systems. And in part, that's why the FERC has ruled how it's ruled, because PJM interconnection, which has been sort of in some ways like maligned recently for instance, not processing interconnection requests fast enough. Work faster, PJM. That whole world of trying to determine what local transmission is needed for localities is something that we don't nearly have the sort of window into like our local transmission owners do. It's sort of local in nature. But you are correct, and I think this is where you're going with this, Senator. I think you are correct in that there have been a lot of debates around the oversight of this.
And it's a cost driver for Kentucky consumers.
I would agree. Thank you, Senator.
Final question, Representative McCool.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. My comment goes along with many other things been said here today. I guess I'm concerned about who's driving the bus. This being a regional approach, how does Kentucky fit in that? How much play do they have? As you've seen, some states are completely under jurisdiction by this, but Kentucky is not. So when it comes to economic development, plus also the cost of individuals, who's driving the bus? Will Kentucky really have a say in this? As a representative, if somebody calls me with concerns, who do I contact? Is it somebody from Pennsylvania or Ohio or wherever? How is this going to benefit Kentucky, and how can we ensure that we're driving a bus not only for the individuals but for economic development? Because that's been one of the keys we've used in previous years, that our energy has been such a low price that we help to draw industry in our way. But somebody else may be controlling that, and we need jobs here.
Yeah, and Representative, that's a great question. And there are just certain items that are within state jurisdiction, and there are certain items where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has jurisdiction, and then we are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Okay, your question is a really good one in that it gets to sort of what is like where is state purview, and then where are states participating regionally and within the federal government sphere. And I would say, at least at PJM, again, we have this robust stakeholder process where we are looking at core business functions like planning, markets, and operations. And the primary interface with PJM interconnection is the Kentucky PSC. And it is within the state of Kentucky. And that's actually the case. It's not, Kentucky is not different in that regard. That is actually the case across the footprint. Across the footprint, the state PSC, which generally speaking has the experts housed internally that understand transmission, that understand markets, they are the primary interface with PJM interconnection. There's a lot of activity going on at PJM, a lot of activity, and the Kentucky PSC is participatory in that activity. And so, the opinion of states is extremely important. The opinion of an organization that actually Chairman Chandler is going to be the president of next year, the Organization of PJM States, is very important to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In fact, two of the commissioners at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are former commissioners, state commissioners that were part of the organization of PJM states that Chair Chandler is going to be the president of next year. And so when you say who's driving the bus, certainly if it's state jurisdiction, you all are driving the bus, and PSC is supposed to effectively implement the statutory authorities provided to them. That's just sort of admin law 101. And within the regional context, the Kentucky PSC certainly is, like I said, the primary interface with PJM, and Chair Chandler will play a big role in that on a going forward basis.
Okay, thank you. I certainly appreciate you being here today, and you've answered our questions. I don't want to drag this out.
Please.
But I have a question that even I sometimes kind of at odds with different things, and so I wanted to ask you this question. On page 8, where you talked about the things that were in the queue, and you look at, let's say, the solar, and a lot of it hasn't been built yet. Is that because much of that is merchant facilities proposed and not, Kentucky utilities? Or
yeah, we don't make a distinction between investor-owned utilities and merchant. Just generally speaking, we have seen very low build, and we've got vertically integrated states that are advancing a intensive decarbonization agenda as well. In fact, in our report, that 4R report, those policy retirements, one of the states that we cite is actually Virginia, that is trying to adhere to its Virginia Clean Economy Act, and an integrated resource plan specifically from Dominion, which is trying to implement the provisions of the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So we don't look at it from investor-owned. We don't look at it from vertically integrated. We don't look at it from a merchant perspective. It's just there are a lot of watts in the queue that are again some combination of solar, wind, battery resource, and we hope they get built because we need the watts. But as we sit here today, they're not getting built.
Well, the reason that I asked that and is that we often will have a company that'll come to Kentucky and we have this monopolistic system here pretty much, except where people operate within a specific area and they have to provide service to everyone. And we'll have maybe a business that'll come in and they'll demand or that a certain percent of their electricity be provided to them through green sources, renewables, or whatever. And I don't normally have a problem with that unless we are shifting that cost to the other consumers here. I was recently at a nuclear symposium, and what they were talking about is that for a lot of the large industries, they could actually come in and do their own small modular nuclear reactors.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so at first I think, well, that's great because they're not asking the other customers to pay for that. They're gonna pay for that themselves, and that's what I normally feel like is the right thing to do. But then maybe our investor-owned utilities and our co-ops would rather them build the small modular nuclear reactor or the solar fields or whatever, because if you allow that large customer to do their own electricity, then that's taking sales away from the existing utilities, and so I'm really not sure which is the best. I don't want a large customer to tell the utilities that they have to provide a certain percentage of their power because it might shift costs the other way. But then if we have that large business that comes in and generates their own electricity, then the fact that they're not buying utilities could increase the other customers' costs as well. And so that's just been something that I have a little bit of dilemma with, and I'm not sure which is the best.
Yeah, I think, Chairman, it's a really interesting question, and we actually are seeing quite a few industrial customers start to locate generation on their facilities just because they're worried, right? They're worried about ensuring that they've got enough power to run their facilities. I used to work at Honda, back in back in the day, and it's a Honda manufacturing, and worked actually above the plant that was building the Civic, and I remember working on sort of this issue of hey, we're going to need our own on-site generation because we're concerned about we want to rely on the system that it was a co-op that's providing, but we're concerned about if that co-op loses power, we need our own power. So we're seeing actually quite a bit of that, and this is not necessarily on topic, but just interesting information. The FERC has actually created the ability for those resources to kind of be aggregated by an aggregator and then participate in wholesale markets that PJM operates in order to receive revenue. So, there's a potential even revenue stream for those, for instance, industrial customers that want to, utilize PJM to obtain wholesale market revenue. Now, many utilities, as overseen by their state public service commissions, have net metering tariffs, right? And it's basically, I generate for myself, so give me a discount. Maybe in some states I can push power to your distribution grid and you can serve customers and then give me a double discount. So that also exists as well. But I think we're going to see a continued proliferation of this. I think we're seeing a lot of it, whether it's on-site solar or some other form of distributed generation resource that's sort of assisting end-use customers that is not even connected to the bulk electric system.
Okay. We certainly appreciate you coming here today, and I think this information has been very important. It's been very enlightening, and I appreciate the fact that you're actually raising some of these concerns that we have about reliability and affordability and those sort of things, because it's very important. And I think the problem that I have, and I think many members on this committee, is that we've been expressing a lot of these concerns about for a long time, and we don't seem to hear. We don't feel like people are listening to us. Policymakers that are providing these types of mandates and from Washington are listening to us at all, and that's really concerning to us, that people that are making decisions may be implementing things that aren't possible right now through the current technologies and that sort of thing. And so the thing that we would ask is that people do listen to us and not try to force things down our throat. I think one of the things that we've been fighting in Kentucky a long time is that any kind of one-size-fits-all policy from Washington is not going to be good for Kentucky. And when we're not allowed to use our resources and things that we have available, that also is not good for Kentucky. And technology is, as you mentioned, is very important. And these things are going to depend on where the technology, what technologies are available in the future. And one of the concerns that I have also is that it seems as if our government is trying to steer technology in certain directions, and as you mentioned, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have had any idea about the shale technology, and that wasn't something that was pushed by the government. That's just something that happened, within the industry, and it was a game changer.
Yep.
And so that's what I also hope is that we don't try to pigeonhole the technology and put all into certain directions that may not go anywhere. And then the other thing is, in 1990, when they did the Clean Air Act, later, my area in West Kentucky, the coal fields were hurt really bad because we had high sulfur coal. And but the technology was really there that allowed the utilities to put the scrubbers on and actually get rid of about probably 85% of the SOx, the NOx, the particulate matter, and the soot. And so that was really really good. But then later, when the Obama administration came in and they started trying to regulate carbon on the Clean Air Act, which it never was intended to regulate, the technology wasn't available to meet the standards that they were trying to force as far as natural gas and coal-fired power plant emissions of carbon. And so that's the things that we are concerned is that, trying to say that technology is available when they aren't, or they're so expensive that in essence forces fuel switching by utilities because of the cost that are going to cause problems like we see in East Kentucky with the huge rate increases there. And so I do believe that the fact that you're bringing up some of these issues and you're willing to come to Kentucky and testify, allow us to ask the questions that we're asking, and to voice our concerns, as many of us have done here today, is something that has to be done, and it gives us some hope that at least maybe someone will listen. And so on behalf of the committee, we certainly appreciate your being here. Thank you so much. It's been one of the best meetings that I can remember in a long time. So
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank
Thank you
you.
all.
okay, members, when is our next meeting?
September, I'm not sure the days.
Okay, well, we'll send you a 2-week notice. So anyway, thank you. Meeting's adjourned.